with fractions is we cannot have 0 in the denominator. Remember back, I don't know when you learned this, but a while ago, you can't divide by 0. You can't. It's impossible to divide by 0. You can't cut something into 0 pieces. So we cannot divide by 0. So any number that will give us a 0 in the denominator makes the function invalid. So in Desmos, you see those as gaps in your graph. So looking for those gaps, now you might be able to figure out where those gaps are just by looking at them, but sometimes it's not so obvious. So what we need to do is figure out what makes the denominator 0. And that will tell us where these gaps are. So that is what vertical asymptotes are. So how do we figure out what numbers are going to give us 0 in the denominator? Well, we can do this pretty simply by just setting the denominator equal to 0. So if I take the denominator, x squared minus 1, and I set it equal to 0, I can figure out what values of x are going to give me 0. So I add the 1 over, so I get x squared equals 1. I then can square root both sides, give me x equals plus or minus 1. So what that tells me is that there is going to be a gap at positive and negative 1. And if we return our graph back to the screen here, we can see that, yep, there is a gap at negative 1 and a gap at positive 1. So how does that look like on our graph? Well, we have a graph like this. Vertical asymptotes, well, any asymptote for that matter, is expressed by a dashed line. Positive 1 and negative 1. And they're vertical, obviously, because these are vertical asymptotes. So we're not going to get into the graphing piece. I just want to show you what those vertical asymptotes look like. Again, to find out where our vertical asymptotes are, we're going to set the denominator equal to 0. So x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals 0. Now this one's not so simple that you could just solve for x. This one you're going to have to factor and then solve. So we think about what numbers multiply to be 2 and add to be negative 3. Okay, we can factor this just like this. What numbers multiply to be 2 and add to be negative 3? We should have guessed negative 1 and negative 2. So x minus 1 and x minus 2. Those multiply to be positive 2 and add to be negative 3. We set them equal to 0, giving me x equals positive 1 and x equals positive 2. So what that means is I'm going to have vertical asymptotes at 1 and 2.